Hello and welcome to Coffee and Control, the podcast in which I find fascinating people working within the field of control and convince them to answer all of my questions. I'm your host, Lucy Hodgins, and my guest today is a professor of swarm engineering at the University of Bristol. So I've been planning to do an episode on robotics ever since I started this podcast because robotics are so cool, and I was looking into what researchers might be good to interview, and I stumbled upon this month's guest. She's done so much cool work on control of robotic swarms and their deployment in various applications, and in talking to her I found out so many fascinating things. So get ready for a deep dive into swarm robotics, artificial evolution, how swarm control can be used in cancer nanomedicine, and the importance of outreach with my guest this month, Professor Sabine Hauert.
I'm Sabine Hauert. I'm professor of swarm engineering at the University of Bristol. My team engineers swarms across scales, from the nanoscale for cancer applications to larger robots for things like logistics or environmental monitoring. And we're excited about all aspects of it, how you do the software and how you do the hardware.
So before I go into the specifics of your research, I'd like to ask you a few questions on swarm robotics generally. So firstly, how would you define a swarm? Like, is this just related to the number of robots, or does it depend on how they interact with each other?
In swarm robotics, the important thing is that robots, just by reacting to the local environment around them, so other robots, people, or just things that are in their environment, are able to collectively achieve a task. And so it's very much about these local interactions that then lead rise to many robots following those simple rules or simple local interactions, achieving a collective behavior. Usually what happens as a result of that is that you can have many robots in the system because it can scale to large numbers or to smaller numbers. Very often, at least historically, these robots have been quite similar, which is what we call a homogeneous swarm. And these swarms are quite robust. So if any of the individual robot fails, the swarm should continue to operate because there is no leader in this swarm. It's all the result of self-organization.
Why is it advantageous to use swarms instead of just using fewer, more complex robots?
So there's many applications that require scale. So if you think of covering large areas to do environmental monitoring, if you think of construction, if you think of the sheer amount of packages that need to be delivered to households, those are all applications that require many, many robots to coordinate. So one strategy would indeed be to have one very fast, sophisticated robot to do that, but you can't even design a single robot system that operates at those scales. And so you need to be thinking about how you coordinate multiple robots. And when you think about that, you can do it two different ways. One is you could do it in a very centralized way. That means that a leader computer basically directs every robot and what they're meant to be doing. That is an interesting approach, especially for warehouses or environments that are very controlled, very well formatted, because you can really optimize those. But when you put things in the real world, in the real messy world, where we don't actually currently see robots because we can't yet get to those scales, distributed intelligence is helpful because the robots no longer rely on a leader knowing everything about the world, everything about every single robot. Instead, the robots are autonomous. They react to the local world around them. And so if we design those interactions really cleverly, then we can scale to those large numbers. So the advantages of the distributed or the swarm approach is typically the scalability, the robustness, and the adaptability as well. They can just get on with things without having a central controller know everything about the world. And very often they can do more than the sum of their parts. So they're better as a collective than the individual robots.
What are the challenges associated with controlling kind of lots of robots?
There's many. One is, how do you design those local interactions? How do you design those rules? And so in the past, we've done this using bioinspiration. So we've looked at flocks of birds or ants and bees or even cellular systems. They can achieve hugely beautiful complex behaviors by following this distributed intelligence. And so biologists have studied those natural systems, and sometimes we take those rules and apply them to artificial swarms. So we've made flying robots flock, we've made robots behave like fish or like ants or even like cells. So that's one strategy.
So while we're on the topic of bioinspiration, I'd just like to highlight a review article released relatively recently that Sabine was involved with, which examined the influence that research into invertebrates had on all aspects of robotics research. So there was one paper in particular from the control side of things that caught my eye. So this paper was titled Decentralized Control Scheme for Myriapod Robots Inspired by Adaptive and Resilient Centipede Locomotion. So the idea was that the authors wanted to develop a control scheme to coordinate multiple robotic legs in real time, and the paper drew inspiration from centipedes. And in the first part of the paper, the authors studied some real centipedes and looked at how their pattern of locomotion changed, either when you removed part of the floor while they were walking, or if you cut off some of their legs. So, from this information, they created a mathematical model and devised a control scheme in which each leg was driven by a local reflexive mechanism based on the ground reaction forces, both of the leg being controlled and the neighbouring legs. But that was just one of many cool examples of taking inspiration from invertebrates, so I do very much recommend going to read the original review article.
But in many real-world applications like logistics, so you want to deliver packages to homes, there might not be an inspiration from nature that's obvious. And so in those cases, swarm engineers like myself need to come up with those rules, with those local interactions. And in the past, we'd guessed. So we'd guess it and simulate it and try to see if it did what we wanted. But increasingly so, we use machine learning. So we do that automatically, basically giving a score to swarms that do the right thing as a swarm, and then we iterate and iterate the controllers or those local rules until they're able to achieve our desired swarm behavior. So that's one challenge. How do we design the rules? Then how do you make good robots that scale in numbers? So that means you want them to be relatively cheap. But if we want them to operate in the real world, they need to be quite capable as well. And so we're now reaching a point in swarm engineering where we can get good hardware made with, good processing power, good sensing, and really this ability to understand the local world around them. So that's sort of the hardware and the software. And then there's the humans. And so if we want to get these swarms out into the real world, which is really a focus of our lab now, we need to figure out how people interact with complex systems like swarms. And one thing that we're thinking about is how can the human monitor the swarm so they understand what the swarm is doing? How can they control the swarm so they can clearly tell the swarm what to do or what not to do? And so those two aspects are really important. How do you monitor and control the swarm? So we're also working on that. And then finally, how do we make sure these swarms are trustworthy? So we've done a lot on ethical deployment of swarms, safe deployment of swarms. How do we verify and validate them? So these are all open questions that are important in terms of getting swarms into reality. And as we move to reality, we're really trying to change actually the way we think of swarms.
Final, more broader question is, I noticed you published a paper recently called Designing Robot Swarms, a Puzzle, a Problem and a Mess, that looked at it from different levels of complexity. So I was wondering what motivated you to write this paper and what insights are gained from it?
So this is really the work of one of my research associates, David Garzon Ramos. And he's been thinking about the evolution of swarms. And historically, we've been designing swarms for very controlled environments. Mm-hmm. And so that's work that's been part of the research over the past 20 years is how do we automatically design these roles, test them in environments where we think they'll work well because that's how we created them, to how do we evolve these systems to more messy environments where things change all the time. How do we go about redesigning these rules? And so that is the direction in which things are going from, these structured environments to the messy world. And actually, if you look at nature is brilliant at dealing with messy environments in the messy world. And I think that's the level we should be aiming for with our swarms.
Before we move on, I wanted to add a little bit more detail about this paper. So the paper puts forward the idea that the design of swarm robotic systems can be analysed from 3 different levels of complexity, termed a puzzle, a problem, and a mess. So puzzles are well structured in the context of swarms. This would be kind of finding a particular sets of rules and conditions that result in desired behaviours within a structured environment. Problems are a little bit more complex and the solutions might not be immediately apparent. So for swarms, this would usually take the form of developing automatic methods of robotic swarm designs. And finally, you have the mess, which is defined as an interconnected and interdependent systems of problems which can't be addressed separately. So, for example, trying to design robotic swarms that can work out of the box in unpredictable real-world applications is definitely a mess. The authors conclude by saying that to solve the mess, a significant effort must be devoted to rethinking research goals and hypotheses and to developing new holistic approaches and frameworks to design robot swarms. So basically, designing swarms for real-world applications is really difficult, but I often think the most challenging research questions are also the most exciting.
So I would like to move now on to the specifics of what you did for your PhD. So from what I understand, you were concerned with designing controllers using artificial evolution, specifically for fixed-wing robots without requiring position sensors. My first question is, what led you to pursuing this PhD kind of at the intersection of swarm robotics and control?
I had a great time studying computer science when I was at EPFL in Switzerland. And then I got excited about the idea of robots, mostly because I took a class by Dario Floriano called Bio-Inspired Artificial Intelligence. And that led me to do a year as an exchange student at Carnegie Mellon in the USA in Pittsburgh. And there I spent the year playing robot football. So there was a team, Manuela Velosa's team of little robot dogs. And we would have these robot dogs play football. And then we competed in the US Championship. It was really exciting. We would, jump up and down when they would score. It was all super fun. And that got me thinking that we needed to find ways to make robots work together and that many future applications would require that. And so I went back to EPFL, to Dario's lab, which inspired me originally, to do work on designing swarms of flying robots to create communication networks in disaster areas. So the idea is there's a disaster, you would throw these little drones in the air, and they would coordinate to cover the area so that you could send messages through those drones to other rescuers or victims in the environment. And so it really came from just thinking, how do you make these robots coordinate? And what is a useful application for that? And then again, these questions of how do you design the swarm is how we went on to use a system called artificial evolution to do that.
So I mentioned you using fixed wing robots. So kind of two questions. Why were you using those as opposed to rotorcraft? And what are the differences? What are the challenges associated with those?
So we were using fixed wing aircrafts. They were about 1 meter wingspan. They were made out of foam, so quite safe, quite lightweight. And they can also fly further. So that means that we were interested in covering large areas. And so it makes sense to have the ability to go faster, to go further, and to also stay in the air a little bit longer than what many of the quads could do at the time.
If you'd like to see what this aircraft looked like, I came across a video that I'm going to link in the notes, which shows these aircraft that are kind of flat and pointy with little wingtips. There's a researcher that throws them up into the air and then they fly off and do their swarming behaviour. And I'd also like to quickly mention that at the time, this was the largest number of robots to have ever been controlled in a swarm, which honestly, very impressive.
It was great fun. Basically, I spent my PhD, first of all, designing swarm algorithms for these aircraft. Some of them were evolved, some of them were bio-inspired. And I'm happy to tell you more about how artificial evolution works if you're interested. And then my colleague, Sevran Levin, built these 10 flying robots. And so it's crazy to think about this. This was 15 years ago. But I could go to farm fields, throw these robots in the air, pretty much on my own. And then they would go up, do the swarm algorithms, cover an area. And all of that was autonomous. We'd click a button and they'd come in and land at the end of the experiments. So it was quite exciting at the time to see all those aircrafts in the air. Doing those simple rules we'd embedded on each one of them.
I did want to ask about artificial evolution, kind of how it works and also how it's different from machine learning, AI, reinforcement learning algorithms.
Artificial evolution is inspired from natural evolution, bio-inspired, like many of the things that we do. And the way it works is that when you want to design a controller for a swarm, you're looking at how do you design the program of a robot. And let's say every robot has the same program because it's following those same local rules. What you would do in generation 0, and this is a virtual generation, you would do this in a computer, is that you would create random programs and then you would copy each program on the swarm. Usually this is done in simulation, but you could do it in reality. And then you test the swarm and you give it a score for how well it was at, for example, creating a communication network. In the case of my PhD, that was the swarm score. And then each one of those programs in that generation gets a score. And then what you're going to do, because you want to evolve the best ones, sort of evolution of the fittest, is you select the best programs with the top scores, and you make a new generation out of those programs. But you don't just copy them over, you also mix them. That's called crossover in the genetic world. And you mutate them. So you add random changes to them to continue to explore the search space. And so based on that, you generate a new generation, you test them, give them scores, generate a third generation. And so you go generation after generation, hopefully improving the programs that are evolved through that process. So that allows us to automatically come up with useful programs. As long as we can simulate our swarm, we can give it a score. How is it different from machine learning? It's a form of machine learning. It's a form of reinforcement learning. We're basically giving a reward to good behavior, except it's done in a bit of a different sequence and in a bit of a structure. And we're also exploring other reinforcement learning techniques to do similar things.
I'd like to quickly mention an extension of this approach that Sabine has been working on in the years since her PhD. So you may be wondering how well the artificial evolution approach is developed in simulation transfer to the real world. Sabine has also been thinking about this, and one approach she's been working on is to implement artificial evolution on each separate robot in a swarm and then use communication between these robots to propagate the information throughout the swarm. And if you'd like to hear Sabine discussing this in more detail, you can go and listen to her on the Complexity podcast, which of course I have linked in the description.
Were there any control strategies that came out of artificial evolution that really surprised you, that you weren't expecting?
Artificial evolution often finds surprising solutions. Actually, that's one of the benefits of it. And if we knew upfront how to design our controllers, we wouldn't use it. So I think being surprised is a feature of this approach. So first of all, the way you design the score is really important. So for example, if you tell a swarm of robots to never hit an obstacle, and your scores never hit an obstacle, usually what gets evolved is that the robots don't move at all, right? That's the optimal. So then you're surprised and then you improve your score. But in the case of my PhD, I had a really challenging problem in that our robots were not meant to have GPS. All they knew was who they were connected to in terms of the other robots that they could communicate with. And so when I had designed those controllers, I came up with one algorithm, which was fun, but it didn't do the performance that I was hoping. And evolution came up with this really interesting strategy where the robots would create chains, and then the chains would synchronize, and then the chain would go from left to right. And that was just not something I had at all imagined. And it really relied on the dynamics of the aircraft and how they turn. So something that was not intuitive to do. And actually, I spent a lot of time reverse engineering those controllers so that I could then put them on the aircrafts. Because at the time I was learning neural networks, which was a bit of a black box. So I needed to really understand what I put on the control of my flying robots before I threw them in the air. So yes, they do surprise us. We still have control. We still design the scores, basically. But that's part of the beauty of the process.
You mentioned earlier supervisory control of robots, like using artificial evolution to design supervisory control strategies. So I guess first question, how would you define supervisory control? Why is it important?
Supervisory control is important because humans want control of artificial systems. So in general, even if your swarm is autonomous, you'd like to be able to tell the swarm what to do. For example, right now we're working on swarms of robots to search for forest fires over huge areas, the size of California, and to detect the forest fires very early on. And so we spent a lot of time speaking to firefighters, 50 firefighters, about what level of control they want over a swarm. And what's been really interesting is that there's a trade-off. I think they understand the notion that the robots need to be autonomous so that they're able to do what they're best at doing and follow their algorithms. But they want to be able to direct where the swarm explores, for example. So maybe putting a square on the screen where the robots should be exploring, and then maybe something gets optimized in the back end so the robots do that in a good way. They want to understand, for example, when a fire is there, what does the fire look like? How should we best extinguish it? So there's these different levels of control that people want. And one challenge is, how do we give them that control? Given that a lot of these properties are emergent. So the behavior of the swarm is only really visible once it's put in a simulator or in reality. And so one thing that we've been doing is both evolving supervisors, so basically thinking so that we can try in lots of different ways what a human supervisor might do to get a better understanding of how at a very high level can we say, okay, swarm go left or right or explore in this way? So we're not giving too many commands from the human level, but the swarm is still able to find solutions that can cater to those high level demands, and also giving choice to the human operators. So in one piece of work that we've done recently, we use a thing called map elites, which is an illumination technique. And what it allows us to do is, rather than just doing artificial evolution, which gives us one answer, the one with the best score, map elites gives us trade-offs. So for example, if I want to make a swarm that's more energy efficient, but also high performance or maybe safer, those are all things that you need to trade off. And so usually you can't get the best of all of those. And so rather than giving one best solution, we give a library of solutions with the different trade-offs, so the operator can choose what they think is the most useful, and they have control over what kind of behaviors get deployed.
So I would like to move on to discussing your work on morphogenesis. So firstly, could you kind of define what's meant by morphogenesis and why is this useful?
So morphogenesis is really about the ability to grow shapes, and ideally functional shapes, shapes that do things. And that work on morphogenesis was done with James Sharp and team, who studied embryogenesis. So our body is full of functional shapes, our organs, for example, that have arisen through cells organizing into specific patterns that are functional. And so in our work on robot-based morphogenesis, what we did was take inspiration from natural morphogenesis or embryogenesis to make not cells, but robot cells. And so in that work, we had 300 little robots called kilobots. These robots are coin-sized. They can interact with their immediate neighborhood around 10 centimeters away. They can send messages to each other within that local environment. And they have a little LED so we know what state they're in. Mm-hmm. And they can also move around, but they're not very precise, but they can move around. And so we were pretending in our swarm that each robot was a cell, so a robot cell. And together they formed a robotic tissue. And this robotic tissue could grow functional shapes. That was the purpose of the morphogenesis. And so it used basically the mechanism that the biologists had described, which is a system called reaction diffusion. It comes straight from Alan Turing. So Alan Turing had noticed that a series of equations created spots and stripes on animals. And so it's fun to explain this through audio alone, because you really need to see it to have it in your mind. But this is how it works. Every robot cell has two virtual chemicals, and they're called morphogens. And these two chemicals, or morphogens, react on every robot, just on their computer. So one creates itself and creates the other one, and the other one depletes itself. So you sort of get this feedback loop. And then these chemicals get diffused through the robot tissue. So they send messages to their neighbors, that's the diffusion, with the values of how much chemical there should be. So these virtual chemicals spread over the swarm. And if you let this run for 10 minutes, the swarm as a whole ends up having patches that arise. So the lights change color based on the chemical levels, and you get these nice green patches that are very systematic. So just like Alan Turing thought that described spots and stripes on animal skin, well, I end up with spots on my robotic tissue. And then in the biological world, these spots would be the places that cells multiply. And then you would have parts where the cells die, but I can't do that with my robot hardware. And so what I need to do is move robots that would have died to places where the robots would be growing. And so from these spots, we start to see these limbed structures protrude, a little bit like fingers protruding. And so over time, instead of having a blob, you end up having a blob with these like protrusions, a little bit like limbs coming out of our robotic tissue. And so what was fun with that morphogenesis is there's many features from swarms that are useful. For example, if you chop out those limbs, they regrow. If you split the tissue, itself heals. So a lot of the properties you get from cellular systems, we see them on our robot tissue.
So I think it was the second paper that you worked on in this area, had a big focus on the controllability of the systems. Could you, I guess, first define what is meant by controllability? Because in control, that has a very specific context.
So I'm guessing a lot of people listening will already know what controllability refers to within the control theory context. If you do, you can skip the next 30 seconds or so, but in case there's anyone listening that doesn't. So within control engineering, the term controllability specifically refers to the ability of a controller to take a system in one state and steer it to some other state within some finite time period. So in the strict sense, a system is either controllable or it's not. However, there's also a thing called the controllability Gramian, which allows you to look at how controllable a system is in various different directions in the state space. So in a sense, this refers to the amount of energy required to travel a particular distance in this direction. And Steve Brunton has made an excellent video on this, which I have linked in the show notes if you're interested in the details.
We were hoping to control the shape. So in the first piece of work, we would get these blobs with 4 legs sticking out, but we had no control over the size of the legs, how thin they were, how far they could reach. And we actually thought that those shapes might be quite useful at exploring environments, sort of little legs that protrude and could explore an environment. And so in the next version of this, we added parameters on top of the swarm so that when a leg grows, we can define whether it's a long and slim leg that can reach very far or a short and stubby one. And again, it's all done through the local rules that you put on the individual cells, and that's what gives you these different types of shapes. It's also inspired from how cellular systems do it. It's based on gradients, basically, and different types of gradients can drive the shapes that are created.
So you talked about kind of being able to control the different shapes. In terms of the uses of the robots, how difficult would it be to kind of identify, a task that you wanted to carry out and then work out what shapes you needed? Is that something you could kind of extend the work to?
We really have, I'd say, blue sky research in the lab and then more applied research. I think this one is more on the front of trying to understand how these reactions work, how you create shapes in this fully emergent property. Without actually saying what shape you want. So I think one of the beauties of it is just like the DNA in cells, it kind of describes what then emerges as a shape. We had a similar process through our robot swarm. Where could this be applied? So I mentioned maybe exploration, although that is quite futuristic in the way we're implementing it. There's simpler ways to do that in reality. But something I'm quite excited about right now is swarm construction. So the ability to create shapes, functional shapes, for example, through construction. And it could be that these structures look very different from, the classical squares and angles that we see in our usual construction world. But I think the ability to grow shapes that are useful, that self-heal, that do interesting things is quite fun to imagine from an application perspective.
So moving on to a different area again. So we've talked a lot about swarm robotics, but you've also done a lot of research on the control of nanoparticles. So could you explain how nanoparticles can be viewed and thought of swarms, and what are the parallels between those and robotic systems?
At the nanoscale, we're interested in the ability of trillions of nanoparticles to operate in biomedical applications like cancer treatment. And I was lucky to spend 3 years at MIT in Sangeeta Bhattia's laboratory that makes nanoparticles for cancer treatment. And what's fascinating is these particles come in different sizes, different shapes, different coatings, different materials. Some of them you can use light or magnetic fields to activate them. You can decorate them with molecules that interact with the surface of cancer cells. And you can load them with drugs that you can release in a more or less controlled fashion. So you have many knobs that you can turn on the design of the nanoparticle. So unlike my flying robots, which I would program, I can't program the nanoparticles because they don't have a computer on board, but I can turn all those knobs and I can change their size, their shape, the material, the coating, what goes in them. And as a result, the 10 to the power 13 of those nanoparticles will have different collective behaviors. And they have actually many of the building blocks that we would have in robot swarms. So they can sense their environment by interacting with it. They can act on their environment by releasing a drug or releasing heat. They can communicate because that thing they release could activate another nanoparticle. So actually it's not that different from some of those coin-sized robots that I had. And I can't control them to go left or right like my flying robots, but I can speed them up or slow them down by making them grow or shrink or self-assemble or anchor themselves in the environment. So they have many of the building blocks that we would look at in swarm robotics, but at the nanoscale. And so we spent a lot of time, first of all, understanding how nanoparticles are currently used and how we can improve even things like how do we penetrate tissue deeper in cancer treatment scenarios, so simpler knobs to turn, I would say, all the way to thinking of more swarmy behaviors that might be implemented in the future.
What attracted you to wanting to work with nanoparticles? I feel like I would be a bit intimidated by the vast number of entities that you're controlling.
The vast number is exactly what made me want to study it. So I was in the farm fields in Switzerland looking at my 10 flying robots, which was really exciting, but it was only 10 flying robots. And in my mind, swarms have the potential to operate in much larger numbers. And so that is the main reason I got excited about nanomedicine and the applications. I mean, there's very real world applications for how you can design better drugs and make them smarter. So it's the combination of both of those things. And so, yeah, I spent a year reading cancer research books, trying to understand something I had never studied at all. And then I was lucky to get a fellowship from the Human Frontiers Science Program, specifically for cross-disciplinary ideas, people who want to go from one discipline and try it in something completely different. And then I was lucky again that Sangeeta Bhatia was like, oh yeah, let's try swarming nanomedicine. So sometimes the stars just align.
What are the differences when dealing with, you said your 10 robots versus like 10 to the 13? Are there control approaches that work well across scales, or do you have to have a complete rethink of how you approach the question?
The fundamentals of making agents that interact with their local environment and then trying to optimize them at scale are the same. So, for example, we use artificial evolution to turn the knobs on the design of those nanoparticles. We give them a score based on how the swarm can treat a specific simulated tumor. So a lot of the mechanisms and the way we think about it are similar. And sometimes the rules, we've used rules from the nano world and put them on the robot world, and they work. So I'd say some of the rules also translate. The physics are very different, so we need to be simulating the right physics. One challenge that we have at the nano world is you can't simulate 10 to the power 13 things in the same way. You can't simulate each one of them. It's just computationally intensive. And so we need to use other maths very often to do that, or we need to know how to break down the problem so that we can, in a high fidelity way, simulate one part of the problem, and from that understand what's happening at a larger scale. So it's we think in the same way about it, but we really need to understand the physics and the questions in a different context.
I think you mentioned already a little bit about the physics working differently on the nanoscale. So kind of how much does that come into your controller design, the fact that the things you're working with are so small?
The simulators are completely different. So at the nanoscale, we'll be simulating nanoscale structures with their diffusion properties, with their binding affinities and reaction rates. All of that is taken from realistic literature. So we have to understand the physics at that scale to be able to do simulations that are relevant. We also need to figure out at what level to simulate. It's tempting to want to simulate everything, every atom, every targeting ligand, every aspect of that particle. But that doesn't necessarily inform how they move, for example, through a tissue. And so I think there's also just a lot of asking people what they think is relevant, what's not relevant. And what's hard as well is when you try to simulate an agent at the nanoscale, you don't have very good data. You can't image them often within those environments. And the way people analyze many of these diseases is in bulk. You know, how many nanoparticles are in the tumor, rather than how many nanoparticles are in this tiny square where there's a cell and how does it interact. So we don't necessarily have that nitty-gritty information that's really useful. But asking those questions sometimes also helps progress the science of it. And actually what we've learned to do is to not find one answer, but to get a sense for ranges as parameters so that we can try lots and lots and lots of combinations. And rather than say, this is the perfect particle, because you won't have a perfect simulation that can tell you that, say, these are the ranges where having a particle that does this would be better. And so that gives you something that generalizes better when you just don't have that nitty-gritty information.
So you touched a little bit on like the simulation can't capture everything about implementing it in real life. What are the differences when you implement it in reality, and also kind of extending to implementing that in an actual person? Would there be challenges associated with that?
We did do preliminary lab-based work. We had a little microfluidic chip device, which was a little artificial tissue, basically a gel with cell-like structures in it. And then we could monitor how deep the nanoparticles were penetrating within that environment. We would really need to work, and we have in the past, with biomedical engineers to test that in more complex situations. What we have done, though, is that some of our models have predictions which have already been validated by in vivo experiments. So, for example, one of our predictions was that if you design a certain particle which is very sticky to cancer cells, they all stick to the first layers of cancer cells rather than go deep into the tumor tissue. And so that was a counterintuitive result somewhat, because a sticky particle that sticks to cancer cells sounds great, but the collective behavior was poor because they all ended up in the same place. And so there's papers that have similar results where we can gain confidence about what our simulations are doing. But really, we need to work with biomedical engineers to be able to engineer some of these systems. In the longer term, we've been working over the past 3 years with John Ives and Matimba Swana, who are more on the bioethics side, to think about what human clinical trials would look like of more sophisticated nanoswarm technology. And there we've been asking questions like, what if you can inject a nanoswarm that stays stealthy in your body and then activates when a tumor cell is detected, to basically treat that tumor cell and check that everything is okay and activate itself only when needed. And so that raises really interesting questions about how that would even work. How do you give consent over a long amount of time? How do you give consent for something that's meant to do nothing, ideally? So how do you even test that? And it's been really interesting to see the stakeholder engagement that she's done, speaking with clinicians, with patients, with those on the more policy side, with researchers as well, to wrap her head around what a framework might look like for such clinical trials. So I'd say it's early days on that front, but I think that's something that's really interesting to think about.
I listened to a recent podcast that you were in, and you mentioned a longer term goal of enabling nanoparticles to make decisions about the current state of a tumor. So I was wondering what that might look like and how you might achieve that.
We've been simulating this, so not testing this in reality. The way it would look like is that you would have, let's say you wanted to check what type of cell was more prominent within a tumor tissue. What you would need to do is send in 2 different types of nanoparticles, for example, one that's triggered by one type of cell and the other particle that's triggered by a different kind of cell. And then you would need the output of those triggers, so say blue particle releases something, red particle releases something else, to react to each other, so that you get as a readout whether blue or red was more prominent within that tumor tissue. So that would allow you to chemically reach a consensus about which one of those 2 cells was more prominent. So this is stuff we've done very much at the robot scale, so the bigger scale. But some of these principles are really just based on local interactions with your environment, simple exchange of messages and flips that basically make you go from one state to another. And so theoretically, there's no reason you can't do that with nanoscale systems. Then cancer is complex. And so we would need to understand what the signals are and actually make that relevant in a clinical context. But I think that ability, given the complexity of tumors, to do the right treatment in the right place at the right time is something that's interesting. How do we make these treatments smarter?
Going back to classical robotics, a different podcast that you're on, you mentioned using algorithms that you had developed for nanorobots and then applying that to physical robots. So I was wondering, what have you learned already from nanoparticles that you might be able to apply, or what do you think might work?
In our nanoparticle simulator, one algorithm that we had was creating trails from just one area where the particles were released to an area of interest within that environment. And so you'd have lots of little nanoparticles in simulation align in a trail, basically showing you how to get somewhere. And we had to make that work by simplifying the swarm rules so that it worked with agents that do diffusion, so random walks, and these simple local exchanges of information. And then what we did is to put it on robots. So for example, we had our kilobots, and we would release our kilobots, those coin-sized robots. They would search the environment, find another robot in that environment, and create these really sleek trails back to the source. And these trails could find the nearest object, they could avoid obstacles, so they could do all these things very easily. And they basically only required robots that can do random motion, exchange of information very locally, and that's it. And what was interesting for us is that those robots didn't require any calibration. We didn't need to care how they moved. So we could just basically get them out of the box and use them. And they could scale to huge numbers. So it worked immediately, basically, very reliably. And I think what that teaches us is when you think of these very simple local interactions that don't require a lot of intelligence from the individuals, what you get and what you need is often scale. So the numbers is where the intelligence comes from. And so it makes you also think of bigger applications. So if you were to think of robots that plant seeds in a farm, in the classical sense, you might make a lawnmower robot that zigzags through the farm field and plants seeds. But if you think in a swarm sense, you might have 100,000 little robot bubbles that just buzz around this farm field and plant themselves with just enough nutrients and water to sustain that specific seed. And that would be a very different way of thinking about how you design robots for planting seeds in a farm. But you wouldn't need a sophisticated robot. You wouldn't need calibration. You could even maybe make these bubbles, like chemically, you shake stuff together and it makes all these bubbles in parallel. And so it's just fun to think that way. And actually, we spent some time making biodegradable robots that we could release and hop around a field and degrade, with that idea that maybe we can produce single-use robots that operate in a bit of a different way than the way we imagine classical robots.
Going on to a different area, less technical. So from kind of researching you a little bit, you seem very passionate about outreach and communicating your research to the public. So I guess first question, why do you think outreach in academia is so important?
I've been running a charity for a long time as well, since my PhD. Currently, it's called the Association for the Understanding of Artificial Intelligence, and it operates AIHub.org and RoboHub.org. And we're passionate about helping people who work in robotics and AI communicate about their work to the general public. And there's lots of reasons. One is that we need to be designing good technology and useful technology. And we can only do that, I think, if we interface with the public and not just talk to the public, but also listen what people want this technology to do for them. And I think we have a responsibility to tell people what we're working on and to demystify the technology. The public include the potential users. They include those who are funding our research very often, the grant makers, the policy makers. And so if we're not telling people what we work on, the risk is there's a void that gets filled in by other sometimes hyped information about the technology. So I think it's really important. For a researcher, there's a lot in it for them as well. So that could be learning how to communicate your work better, just getting great ideas by producing podcasts and talking to lots of interesting people. I've found great friends, PhD students, colleagues through social media, which actually gives us many abilities to connect directly. So I think it's a great thing to do. Not everyone needs to do it, and there's very low-key ways of doing it. Just kind of amplifying really interesting stuff is already a good step. But if you're into it, I think by all means, I think that's really useful.
So Sabine just mentioned robohub.org and AIHub.org, and I would really recommend going to check out both these websites. So robohub.org hosts the Robot Talk podcast, which releases weekly episodes interviewing researchers about all different aspects of robotics. And the website also has a ton of fascinating articles. So one that I particularly enjoyed was an article about the way that drones will change the way that buildings are designed, from which I discovered that researchers are currently creating drones that can 3D print structures, either for restoring existing buildings or for creating structures in disaster zones. And there's a video you can go watch, which is really, really cool. And AIHub.org is similar, but unsurprisingly with a focus on AI. So from that website, I found some cool articles on the use of AI in drug development, as well as the environmental impact of generative AI. So yeah, definitely worth going to have a look at both of those websites.
The Nature article you wrote in 2015, you mentioned about the need for change in terms of what classes as success in academia, and that at least at the time didn't tend to include outreach activities. Do you think that's changed at all since you wrote that article?
Value in science communication is important. And I do believe it's changed, but probably not everywhere. So for example, where I am here at the University of Bristol, for promotion, there is a category which is all about outreach and engagement. And so if you've done that is used and is useful towards your promotion case. So in that's a case where it is definitely valued. Increasingly, grants want to know that they're not just funding the research, but they're also funding the communication of that research. And so that's also being valued in the grant making process. I think it's very often a balance, though. I think sometimes people might worry, oh, this person does mostly communication, but where is the research? And so I would say the important thing is to keep the balance right, because doing great research sometimes makes you a great communicator, but also doing the communication will change the research that you do. And so, yeah, I think there's room for every kind of communication, and you can do as much or as little as makes sense for you. But I think it is increasingly valued, especially in this climate where you hear a lot of noise, and I think people want to hear some of these stories break through.
Do you think people's attitudes to robotics and AI has changed in the, 15 years you've been working in the area?
It's always changing. I think the desire to know how it'll impact people is always there. And we did really interesting work with the Royal Society on public perception of machine learning. And what was fascinating then, that was before the big AI increase recently, was that most people didn't know what machine learning was. And so just the fundamentals of what is this technology and what can it do for them on a day-to-day basis, or what are they worried about, I think is really, really important. And what changes is, what are they worried about? What technology is it that they don't know about now? So I think this is a never-ending job, basically, of keeping this communication channel open. I think with AI, people now can use it. And so that's made it very real for them. What I'd like to see happen with robots is that people encounter them in their everyday life, and that they work with them, they operate in their homes. Many people, not many, but I'd say one of the most successful robots is the robot vacuum cleaner. And I think that's the level at which we really start to have a meaningful conversation, because these things no longer are science fiction. They're embedded in people's lives. And I would say that's usually when the conversation really changes. It's when it becomes real.
I've got a few quick fire questions at the end. The first one is more general in that, where do you think the field of swarm robotics is headed, and what are you most excited about?
Our big focus in the past 5 years has been making swarms for people. So we mostly spoke about, I'd say, the research swarms, but we have a big piece of work on how do we make swarms for logistics? How can these robots be used to do hub to doorstep delivery? How can we use swarms to detect wildfires? How can we use swarms in social settings as well, as little sort of smart post-it notes that everyone can interact with and brainstorm? So that question about how do we get these robots out is something we're excited about. We're thinking of startups, basically, to make that real. And we've also realized that definitions around swarms, like huge numbers, the fact that they're autonomous, the fact that they're homogeneous, all of those, I think, are being relaxed so that we can make these swarms work in the real world. So, for example, these systems probably will be heterogeneous, lots of robots that do different tasks and have different hardware and different control, but they need to work together at the level of a city or of your home. And so that heterogeneity is something that we're excited about. The fact that they're autonomous, yes, but there needs to be that human monitoring and control and the ability to have confidence that the swarm is doing the right thing. So that's something as well that we're pushing. The denseness, so the idea that you have lots of robots everywhere, I think we're thinking a bit differently. You're going to have lots of robots, but you're not going to see 100 of them. You're going to see one here, and then maybe your neighbor has one. And so it won't feel like a swarm this very dense way, but it'll still be a swarm at the scale maybe of your city. We're thinking as well that our robots probably won't be simple. They're going to be really sophisticated robots because they need to make sense of the world around them. And so we're also making platforms that are better than those coin-sized robots, like our latest robots, the dots. They have GPUs, CPUs, laser range scanners. They've got lots of really good kit, but they're actually still quite cheap. And so we're getting sort of in a space in swarm robotics where we're ready, I think. We have good hardware, good way to design algorithms. And I think it's all now at a tipping point in terms of making them real.
Are there any applications of swarm robotics that you haven't researched yet that you would like to?
We're exploring the field of construction. That's the next one that I'd be excited about. So how do you build structures using robots? And maybe the bricks are robots too. How do they self-assemble themselves? So I think we're thinking quite creatively in terms of how robots might do construction in the future. That also goes for solar stations in space. So there's anything with large structures is fun.
Similar question. Are there any controllers that you haven't applied to swarm robots yet that you'd like to, or are kind of starting to think about?
I can't think of a specific controller I would like to try. We're getting excited about the use of generative models like ChatGPT. One thing we're exploring is how these systems, these LLMs, can help robots interact better with the world around them. So they're still going to have their local rules. They're still going to have their algorithms in terms of a swarm control. But how can they look at a picture and make sense of what that picture says? How can they make a decision and then communicate that using language to other robots or to other humans in the environment? And so that hybrid between how do we use these LLMs plus swarm intelligence is something that we're also quite excited about.
What's your favorite thing about your job?
What I love about my job is really the swarm behind the swarm. So the people who work in my team, and they come from many different disciplines, sometimes biology, medicine, ethics, robotics, computer science, AI. And that mix, I think, is so rich and really exciting. And I also like that now we're thinking of big real world problems. I think it's gotten everyone imagining that they can change something about the future, or at least be part of what gets made. So that my favorite part is meeting with my students, my postdocs, my master students, and just getting a sense of what it is that we're making and trying to do something that hopefully is useful for the future. I love working in this field.
Do you have any role models within either robotics, artificial evolution?
I've been very lucky in my career to have great role models. So my PhD supervisor, Dario Floriano, really instilled this vision. How do you have a big vision and how do you go for it? And then at MIT, I worked in Sagita Bhattia's laboratory. She was an amazing role model on how you run a lab, how you do nanomedicine. I really enjoyed working with her. She would have these Ask Me Anything sessions with her postdocs and PhD students where we could just ask her random stuff about life. And I always found that was a great thing to do. Actually, today I have an Ask Me Anything with my school. So we're just trying to pay it forward. And then every week I would go to Radhika Nagpal's lab, who's very well known in swarm robotics. And she was in Harvard. And so she let me go to her lab every week to get a robot fix, even though I wasn't formally part of her lab. But that's just because I was with the nanoparticles and I needed to see robots. And she is such an inspiration in terms of how do you have a wonderful and exciting career while still really caring for the people who work with you and just being mindful about how we create a great community for research. So I feel like those three people definitely put me on a great pathway. And then in the university where I am now, I think in general, it's very cross-disciplinary, very open. I just feel very lucky.
Final question. What's your favorite project or paper to have worked on?
I don't think I have a favorite paper. Everyone feels like a milestone. My favorite papers, just in general, are the ones that get rejected several times and then get accepted and sometimes even win Best Paper awards because I think new ideas, they get rejected because they're, we haven't followed the right benchmark. We haven't done things in exactly the way they want us to do them, but they're new and we need to try them out and they're fresh and they take a bit longer. But when those papers come out, I'm so proud of them. And I think those ones really make a difference because we're sort of changing the way things are done.
Thank you so much for the interview.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was a great conversation.
So, in summary, swarms of robots can be useful to achieve tasks that require scale. Artificial evolution can be used to develop new and unexpected control strategies for these swarms. Morphogenesis allows us to use very simple tools to grow and control interesting shapes. The nanoparticles used in cancer treatment can be treated in a similar way to robotic swarms, and there's a huge range of other applications that swarm robotics can be useful for, including logistics, construction, and wildfire detection. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. It's been slightly less focused on the theoretical side of control, but if you're longing for more maths, don't worry, because next episode I'm going to be talking to a researcher who does a ton of very interesting theoretical work on behavioural systems and data-driven control. If you want more from Sabine, which of course you do, why wouldn't you? She's also been interviewed on a few other podcasts, which I've linked below, as well as a bunch of TEDx talks. I especially recommend the Complexity podcast. There's a little bit of overlap with what was discussed in that and what we've covered in this episode, but they tend to come at it from a different angle. If you want to keep up to date with the latest coffee and control news, you can follow us on Instagram, X and Blue Sky. The next episode will be released on the 1st of April, so until then, I hope you have a wonderful month.